So let's get into why we're here. We want to connect to some external data that is sitting outside of the current SharePoint site. Now you're ready to get going, but I need us to slow down for a second and think about what we're doing because there's two very important questions to ask before we jump in. One, why are we doing it? And two, where is your data? And when I ask why you're doing this, I mean, what's the reason in each case? Is it a one-off ad hoc need? Say you just need a single web page on a single SharePoint site to connect to some orders database and show a list of recent orders. Now this would take the shortest time to do, but it is a one-off. It would be created and customized on a single page, and it's not a reusable solution, though this is often fine. But another scenario might be that you want to define a connection to an external data source because you want something that behaves more like a regular SharePoint list. You want to show it in multiple pages and multiple web parts, even in multiple sites. You want to reuse that data across different lists and libraries. You might even want that data searchable in SharePoint. And we can do this too. It is more flexible, but it's also more complex to set up. Now, in this course, we're going to do both, but you want to be specific when you're choosing your method and think about what you need in each business case. So then there's question two, where is your data? And the simplest answer here would be your data is in a database somewhere, but it could be from a web service or it could be from an XML file. These are the external sources that SharePoint can deal with, and we'll cover them one by one. Regardless, your main problem is always going to be security. It won't be about getting the data onto your page or customizing it to show what you want. It's being allowed to get to that data in the first place because most data sources, except for the most casual, are going to need some kind of credentials. Let me show you what I mean by talking about connecting to a database. Scenario number one, forget about SharePoint for a second. Imagine that we log on to our PC in the morning and we open up an installed application on our desktop machine. It's going to connect to a database on a remote server. The database is going to ask who we are, and we will supply some credentials, either by typing in a username and password or by automatically using the same user ID and password that we logged onto that machine with. The database checks them and says, okay, you're Simon, I know you, come on in, fine. Now we want that same data, but we want it on a SharePoint web page. It doesn't sound like a big problem, but the thing is, it's not us talking to the database anymore. What we're going to do is we'll open a browser on our PC and we will request a page from a SharePoint server. And we pass SharePoint our credentials. Now SharePoint says, hang on, before I send this page to you, I'm meant to fill it with data from the database. And it connects to the database, but the credentials it's passing is not our identity anymore. It's the SharePoint server identity. And if the database doesn't have knowledge of the SharePoint server, it's going to refuse the connection. Now, sure, this is a fixable problem, and we actually have a few ways of dealing with this, but they're all more about your own organization's rules than they are about SharePoint. One, what we could do is we could add a specific account in the database just for the SharePoint server, and we'll tell SharePoint to always use those credentials. Now, that's a nice, easy fix. It can be done very quickly, but it has its own problems, because now everyone viewing that page in SharePoint is effectively using the same account to connect to the database. Now, that's not a problem by itself, but if you require auditing and logging, you're not going to know which individuals were viewing or changing that data. Option two, we can do what's called pass-through authentication. When we log on to SharePoint, we're telling SharePoint to take our credentials and pass them right through to the database to connect to that external system. This sounds like a great solution, but it's difficult to do. And the problem is nothing to do with SharePoint. It's that machines in general aren't allowed to just grab identities and pass them around, because this would lead to all sorts of security problems. And a third issue is that sometimes we use different sets of credentials to access different databases or external line of business systems. And you have multiple sets of credentials for each individual, and throwing this into the mix is going to further complicate things. Now, as we'll see, SharePoint can deal with all of these situations, but you have to have a pretty good idea of what the rules of your external system are before you start to connect to it.